In this video, we're diving into the 3D assets that serve as the building blocks when crafting your cinematic short film. I'll walk you through how I put together everything I needed for my story, the visual concept, the props, the location itself, and set dressing, and also some tips on how you can save a little time on these steps. In the last episode, we talked about listing all the assets mentioned in your script, and depending on your script, it can be a short list or a very long list. So the next step is to then divide that list into secondary items and hero items, and get some reference images that help you figure out your visual style. For the Craving, I knew I wanted a realistic, worn and weathered style, and I spent some time finding or generating concept images with the help of Midjourney and such. This is also a good time to storyboard your film. Start planning your shots. This will save you time later. The secondary items are stuff that needs to be there but isn't the center of the focus. Like a car in a parking lot visible in the background, or maybe like the dresser in the Craving where it needed to be there for Fisher to get the shirt from, but it's never really shown up close in detail. Now I know from experience that we all want everything to look top tier, but don't spend a lot of time on these items if you know they belong in the background. But if you're not the director of the film and you're working for someone, be careful with this, because the director might one day tell you to get a close-up of something you didn't expect, and then you might be in trouble if the assets are less than optimal for that. But if you're the one calling the shots, this is one way to save precious time. The hero items are stuff that you know will be visible in the camera and need to look good. Maybe the headphones your character is wearing throughout the film, or a plate of soup, or a ring that's going to be in close-up. For the Craving, I modeled some assets in Blender, found some on the Unreal Marketplace, or Fab as it's called now, and I even tried an AI generation on a couple of the things. The modeling itself wasn't really anything out of the ordinary, so I won't go too deep into that, but one thing I put a little more effort into was the cabin itself, where most of the action of the film happens. And I didn't storyboard the Craving on paper, but I had a strong vision of how I want the stage and film things. Staging essentially means where the characters are standing, where they move, and how the camera is placed in relation to that. And this informed me of the space I want to put the characters in, the set itself. One of the benefits working in 3D is getting to make customized sets and locations that work well with your staging, and not having to struggle with an actual locations that always have their challenges and sometimes force you to compromise. Ideally, you don't want your set and location to be just a background. The more you can incorporate it into your staging, the better. It makes it feel more real. So the script called for a few specific things from the cabin. We needed a door, windows on both sides, a place for the bed, for the table, a little room upstairs, and the stairs obviously, and a direct view from Fisher's bed to hers through the cracks, through the floorboards and such. Other thing I considered was breaking the cabin into modular pieces for Unreal, in case I needed to move a wall out of the way when working on a scene, but I ended up not doing that. But that's an option if your project needs it. I found this pack of small props on Fab and used it together with Quixel library assets to set dress the cabin. I suppose you could use a tool like Dash to help with this, but I opted to do it manually in this case because I was just learning Unreal at the time and I wanted to get a feel for it and not have Dash do some magic under the hood, you know. The island was largely built by layering Quixel or Megascan rocks, and the sea around is the cinematic ocean asset from Fab. It's a great asset for sure, but unfortunately the only piece of this whole thing that, at least at the time, didn't support path racing. So there are a couple of assets I couldn't find, at least at a decent price, and I didn't have time to make them myself. So out of curiosity, I tested AI generating a couple of the assets. I used Meshy 3D, and it took a couple of iterations to get what I wanted stylistically, but it was good enough for either a secondary item or to be improved manually later. Would I do this for all assets in the film? Probably not. But I'd say it's a good backup when all else fails, or you're just sort of brainstorming or finding inspiration. Once you have all your assets, you can start putting your scene together. In Unreal, create a neat and organized folder structure. You'll thank yourself later, trust me. These projects can turn into a chaotic mess of random files if you're not careful. In Unreal, FBX is the standard format for 3D models, but you could look into USC as well. Now, something I struggle with with no super obvious solution was pivot points. If you just drag your file into the content folder and import it, Unreal resets your model's pivot point to the world origin, which sometimes makes things hard to animate. But if you go to File, Import into Level, you get slightly different options. Change Blueprint Asset to Level Actors to keep parts of the model separate and not combined into one object. And check Beg Pivot in Vertex to keep the original pivot points from Blender. You can also experiment on unchecking the root node if the placement of the parts is off. Also, one thing you might consider doing is to build your set on one level and then use that as a sub-level on your other scenes. That way, if you make a change to your set, it will update automatically to all your scenes using that set. It might not be suitable for your project, but it's good to know the option. So, import your assets and start building the first version of your location. I say the first version because there's something you need to do before you can go into too much detail. And that is camera blocking. This is where the planning of your shots comes to play. Now, ideally, you do the blocking with your actors or characters in place, but if you're doing motion capture, it might be beneficial to do the initial rough camera block out first, so you'll have a better understanding of what kind of shots you need your actors to perform. Kind of like a storyboard 2.0. Something to keep in mind, both when building your assets and in motion capture stage, use real-life scale for everything. Use reference and take measurements to make sure things are the right size. Because it can easily happen that you build your set in Blender, and once you add your character in Unreal, they're suddenly out of scale. Like the character is way bigger than the house sometimes or something like that. So build a scale and then measure your set. The distance from the door to the bed, the height of the chair or doorknob, and have something on the motion capture stage as a reference so the actors are working in the real measurements of the location. Maybe tape on the floor for general layout of the room, or a tennis ball at the height of the doorknob. That makes it easier to align animations later to the virtual set without having to do so much manual fixing. It doesn't really matter which one you do first, the motion capture or the location modeling, as long as you keep in mind the scale and alignment and use one as a reference to the other. I'm going to go over the meta-humans and motion capture process in the next episode, so gently press that subscribe button and tickle that bell, so you'll be the first to know when that video drops. Okay, let's jump ahead for a bit and pretend you have your character animations in place and ready to go. Now you can do the final camera block out of your scenes, and we'll go into more detail about camera work later, down the line in its own episode. But for this episode, the block out has a different goal, and that's finalizing the set dressing. Only focus on areas that are visible to the camera. If the camera does not see it, it doesn't need to be there. And you don't need to waste time on it. So place your props strategically so your shots don't look empty and your backgrounds aren't filled with useless clutter no one ever sees. In video games, this of course doesn't work because players can look around freely, but in films, you should absolutely weaponize this strategy. This ties into creating nice compositions, but let's touch on that subject in a later video. So that's our location and set ready to go in Unreal. I hope you picked up a few useful tricks along the way. If you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment. And in the next episode, we'll take a look at our characters. I used a free solution for the motion capture and pretty much the laziest method of cleanup for it, so stick around for that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.